Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Roxanne Adler-Hickey, and I'm the Interim Director of the William & Mary Washington Center. On behalf of William & Mary, I am pleased to welcome you to the first webinar in a three-part series about leadership. These webinars, focused on leading with compassion, are designed to offer you lessons, opportunities to reflect, and concrete tools that you can take away and use immediately. So whether you're a new, emerging leader or a seasoned veteran with years of experience, we intend to offer you a new way to consider how you lead. Focused on topics like inclusivity, courage, and belonging, we hope that you enjoy the chance to learn from alumni leaders and William & Mary faculty. I'm honored to be here today with many of my colleagues who partnered with me to make this happen. I'd like to specifically thank Vice Provost Anne-Marie Stock, who initially encouraged me to brainstorm and approve this idea back in March. Also, a huge thank you to Michael Steelman, who many of you likely already know as our Director of Alumni Career Management and Professional Networks, who partnered with me to reach out to our prestigious alumni and manage many of the logistics involved. Today could not happen without his tremendous efforts. Finally, thanks to my team from the William & Mary Washington Center who've worked with me on these plans for many months. Countless others offered advice through focus groups and counseled me over email, through Zoom, and I'm grateful to all of you. In these new and interesting times, it is a joy to find strength in our greater William & Mary community, and this project is truly an example of collaboration. We are one William & Mary, and we thank you for joining us today. These webinars, as you likely know, are a bit of a teaser, a taste of a pilot course that we're hoping to offer this spring. The course would be a more involved version of the type of conversation in which we're going to engage today. So please make sure that you share your thoughts in our brief poll at the end of our session and in our follow-up survey that you'll receive via email in the coming days. Your feedback will help us shape the next offering. But for today, please type any of your questions in the chat feature so that our presenters will try to answer them in the final portion of our hour together if we're able. Today's session is focused on compassion in leadership, and it features proud alumnus Michael Powell, who has dedicated his time speaking over and over to students at William & Mary. They are, as are all of we who hear him, consistently inspired by his messages on leadership. Thank you, Michael, for joining us today. Partnering with Michael is Drew Stelljes, Assistant Vice President for Student Engagement and Leadership. Drew has been teaching about leadership and community engagement in the William & Mary Washington Center for almost 10 years now. His robust student following is truly a representation of the type of transformational leader that he is. I know you'll enjoy learning from him today. And so without further ado, I am pleased to introduce to you Drew Stelljes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am so glad to have a chance to share some time with you. To Roxanne and the team in the Washington Center, to Michael and the team in the Alumni Association. What a great collaborative, what a great partnership. For the next 20 minutes or so, I want to walk through a basic understanding of how we approach leadership at William & Mary. The first thing that we talk about with our students is that as we are learning about leadership, part of the call is to find our voice. To find our voice in being able to share with a sense of conviction and humility, with a sense of confidence and humility, who we are, what we care about, what we believe in, and how we can live a life that's driven by our values, the values that we hold most dear, the values that we're most proud of, and really the values that we want to espouse now and into the future. So when we talk about finding your voice and thinking about being a transformational leader, finding our voice gives us a chance to give voice to others. What I want to do now is I want to walk through just a very basic overview. In the next slide, we'll start this. I want to walk through a basic overview of what it is that how we approach our work. I want to talk with you a little bit about courage and how we define that, about compassion, and about trust. So we define courage as this, is showing up into an environment where you can't control the outcome. There are so many examples of this right now for each and every one of us on the call. We don't know what to expect in the next day or the next month or down the road, but it's showing up and it's participating, even though we know it's the harder thing to do, and that's courage. In the next slide, I'll show you a quote from one of my favorite researchers. It's a quote by Renee Brown. And the quote really shares with us this idea of showing up and letting others be seen. Renee Brown writes, "Courage starts with showing up and letting ourselves be seen, because true belonging only happens when we present our authentic, imperfect selves to the world. Our sense of belonging can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance." So if we're starting out with a deep and sincere look at our values, how we want to live our life, we get to that point of more and better self-acceptance so that we can start to present our true, authentic selves to our colleagues, to our families, to the members of our team. So let me walk you through the next slide and talk a little bit about compassion. This is a webinar series that includes an understanding of leadership with compassion. And compassion is generally defined as a recognition of other people's pain, but then an action to help alleviate the pain. So sympathy might be, or pity might be, I recognize that you're in pain. Compassion is an action to help alleviate the pain. And it's a tangible expression of concern for someone else who's suffering, whether that's in the workplace or at home or others. Let's take it to the next slide. And now what I want to do with that as our framework, I want to walk each of us through about a 15-minute overview of how we describe leadership at William & Mary. The first thing I want us to think about is this, is imagine yourself for a moment in the bookstore or on Amazon, and you type in the word leadership, or you go to the leadership section at Barnes & Noble. And we know that there are a plethora of leadership books. The next time you go in, maybe utilize some of the things that I discuss in the next 15 minutes to consider how you might have a more sophisticated look at these various leadership books. And I'll describe that a little bit more later. So there are four major components of what I want to share with you, sort of four takeaways for this time together. And the first is this idea that leadership is paradigmatically derived. What does that mean? Well, basically it means leadership is based on the basic lens through which a person sees the world. It's their paradigm. It's the way they see things and see the world. What I'm about to show you a teaser of the four different paradigms, I think is a great illustration of how our citizens within our country are seeing the progress of our country through different paradigms. So you could almost place yourself, or maybe even your neighbors, family, or friends in this. So the four research paradigms, which I'll describe in a little bit more detail in a second, are positivism, constructivism, critical theory, and postmodernism. And every theory that we have is born out of a paradigm. It's born out of a way of thinking. So let me talk about the first. If we can go to the next slide, I can share a little bit about research paradigms. So the four research paradigms are as follows. Positivism. Positivism presumes that universal truths exist about leadership. And the goal of leadership research and theory, is to provide truth answers or prescriptive answers that may or may not resonate with you. For some on this call, you might think, well, is it possible, is it feasible for leadership to be about universal truths? and others may agree that it is. The second paradigm is this idea of constructivism, that leadership is understood based on an individual's life experiences, and it can differ dramatically based on one's culture in context. So leadership is relational, and a lot of attention is paid to interactions between people and processes with one another. This is a leadership perspective paradigm that really speaks to a lot of people, is that based on your lived experiences and your personal reflection on those experiences, how you made meaning of that experience has an impact on how you are going to derive definition and understanding of leadership. It's contextually bound. It's culturally bound. It's based on your interpretation of lived experiences. The next is this idea of critical theory. Critical theory posits that leadership is defined by and reflects the values and the beliefs of dominant groups. So understanding power is central to leadership, which can be abused as a tool or used as a tool. It can be abused as a tool to maintain social stratification, to maintain the privileges that come with the dominant group. When I say the dominant group, it's the group that has the authority and has the ability to publish, to write, to speak to large audiences about their beliefs. So critical theory is defined by and reflects the values and beliefs of those who have the privilege to be able to speak to large groups about their perspective on leadership. And then postmodernism is this idea that leadership, along with its relative value, the whole point is to challenge it as a means to disrupt the status quo. So a postmodernist would say a leader's responsibility is to disrupt the status quo. And so it's questioning anything framed as truth, because to a postmodernist, truth as objectivity and universality is impossible. There's no such thing as positivism, right? The truth is impossible. Okay, so those are the four major research paradigms. And one thing that I hope you would take away from this is, as you're hearing it, and it's obviously quick and it's a cursory understanding of it, be thinking to yourself, where do I fit in this? And where do some of my colleagues, my family, my friends, my peers fit into this? It starts to help us understand a little bit about how people are making sense of the world around them. And it also starts to help us have a much more deeper understanding of the academic core around leadership development. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So first we've got that leadership is paradigmatically derived. On the next slide is that leadership is socially constructed. So what does that mean? Well, it means that leadership in itself doesn't functionally exist. It represents an abstract set of concepts that are identified, that are named, and are understood by groups of people. I think of it as the idea of money or the dollar bill. People have to all sort of buy into the idea that a dollar bill that has the number 1 on it is worth less than a dollar bill that has 20 on it. And so enough people have to buy into it that it becomes the norm. And that's the same with leadership. So leadership represents this abstract set of concepts that are identified and that are named, that are understood by social interactions among people. And if you are a critical theorist, you would say that the perspective, the abstract set of concepts is being pushed by dominant groups who have the authority and who have the privilege to be able to push out dominant concepts. Okay, so that explains though why each of us may have varying reactions to different interpretations of leadership, because leadership is socially constructed. And so some people would go, I really cringe at this idea of this model of leadership in my office, but I really resonate with this model of leadership. And we can start to understand a little bit more why that is, because it's socially constructed. Okay, next slide. The next slide is about how leadership is inherently values-based. Okay, so this is the great example of this is in Hitler, and the big debate that we constantly have on whether or not Adolf Hitler was an effective leader. Well, pre-1950s or so, leadership models, frameworks, and informal theories did not include values as a component of their framework. So some would argue that leadership was value-free. It's neutral, or it's simply about the effectiveness of the person. It's about the transaction. It's about the achievement of the goal. So if the goal is to expel a portion of the population and that was achieved, people would argue that Hitler in himself was an effective leader. Well, along comes this idea that leadership has to be inherently values-based. It essentially redefined leadership as intrinsically good and positive. And we could argue that, and that's a great thing to be able to debate and discuss in class. But because of social construction, leadership theory isn't just inherently values-based. It also communicates which values are acknowledged, which values are deemed important, which values are considered appropriate. And so when you go to the bookstore and you're looking for books on the leadership on the shelf, you can, as you start to see, you can probably see that there are cultural influences based on our time period. That if you were looking at that bookshelf in the 1950s, the words that were used to define, in other words, the titles of the book, would be different than they are now. And that is in part because of the cultural norms, the cultural influences, the social implications and consequences of what's happening across our country now are having an impact and an influence on how we see leadership. And so culture, and I don't mean organizational culture necessarily, but I mean dynamic, large group culture is having an impact and influencing the way we see leadership. So a lot of the things that we talk about are actually not formal theories, right? So in science, in hard science, in biology, for example, right? You collect your data, you develop a hypothesis, you experiment, and you develop results. Some of that, to an extent, is done in leadership. But being that it's a social science, what a lot of times we find ourselves doing is pulling together experts that bring together their various research, and over time they develop models or frameworks, but they're not formal theories. An informal theory is just an untested personal proposition about the nature of a phenomenon. A model is a descriptive representation. And so in your organizations, in business, every couple of years, I imagine, there's a new model or a framework that's being espoused. Well, that framework is being driven by groups of people who have experienced something, and based on lived experience, constructivists, they're starting to reconstruct and retool what they think is the best way to approach something. So you imagine around a conference room table, 15 people who are working together and they're describing stories of their experiences. And those stories essentially become the elements of their own internal or in-house research on what it means to develop leadership models or frameworks. And I'm not trying to displace them as unimportant, but I am saying that that's simply what they are. A model is a representation, it's just a descriptive representation, and a framework is just a representation of a collective group of people's ideas. So, therefore, leadership is indicative of the place and the time, the cultural influences of the historical period, the people who have the positionality to assert ideas around leadership. And we have to understand that leadership models are at least somewhat influenced by the biases and the stereotypes, the mores and the insights and the inventions of the time. So we are being influenced outside of the bubble, say, of academia. We are being influenced by individuals who have authority to assert about leadership are discussing and are writing about. And then finally, leadership, and the next slide talks about this. Leadership is interdisciplinary. I love that it's interdisciplinary because I think it really speaks to the possibilities of teaching and learning in higher education in the 21st century. Leadership is actually seen as a young and emerging area that draws from writing across multiple disciplines, ranging from political science to education to psychology and business. And it relies on interdisciplinary approaches that are integrated, that are synergistic. It would be difficult to think about leadership without considering the ways in which groups manage strategic processes. But you also have to understand the social and cultural context that require learning the skills about how people are going to react to that. So if we take a leadership framework and model and place it in an environment, in a culture that is really foreign to what we are used to, there's a likelihood that that model is not going to work, right? And so anyway, when we understand that leadership is interdisciplinary in nature, it kind of opens up wide open the opportunity for collaboration in the context of understanding cultures. Okay, so that's, let me move on to the next slide. But that's really the basic understanding now of how we would approach the beginnings of discussing leadership in class. These four concepts: that leadership is paradigmatically derived, that it is values-based, that it requires that people sort of buy into it. It is not, it's not inherently something. We have to come to collectively own it, and that it's interdisciplinary. And as this slide suggests, is that most times they are models, frameworks, and informal theories. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. As a takeaway, I want to share with you what I have learned to be the importance of curiosity and observation, through observation. I love a young professional who's deeply curious, who with an incredible sense of humility asks questions to learn more and wants to know more about the place and about how to solve problems. So the next slide gives a few just simple examples of this. Through observation and learning observation techniques, it's really changed my perspective. It's given me a sense of, and it's allowed me to have my own voice by listening really intently to what people are actually saying, to what they're saying that's beneath the layer of the words that they're using. So how do you do that? Well, one thing is to practice and then make it habit this concept of curiosity by asking people, tell me more about that. You know, I'm not quite sure I understand how that works for you. I'd love to know more. And then to repeat back. These are wonderful, basic sort of active listening counseling techniques. It sounds like you feel like you're in a tough position. Is that about right? It sounds to me like you feel stuck in your work. Is that about right? And is there a way that I can help you maybe to get unstuck? A number of you probably on the line probably are fans of the work of Brene Brown. And one of the things that Brown talks about a lot is related to what we're talking about today. But I want to start my part is sort of finishing up and talking about this idea of trust. Because I think the most highly effective leaders, through a process of intense curiosity, having really good observation skills, being able to repeat back what they heard, build trust. And how is trust built? Well, we've learned over 30 plus years that trust is built actually in really small moments. Trust isn't necessarily built in the moments where the CEO gives a big speech. There's an opportunity to build trust, and there's an opportunity to betray. And because we know that trust happens in the smallest moments, the moments when maybe you would least expect it, those are also moments that could lead to betrayal. To choose to connect with someone when they're asking for it is the opportunity. But to choose to deny that is where there is betrayal. So an example of that would be this. If I'm walking through the house one night and I'm kind of quiet, I'm not myself, and my wife turns to me and she says, "Stop. What's going on?" I can tell something's wrong. And I know that she has 5 or 6 other things to do. We've got 3 kids that need your help. But she took a moment to stop and say, "No, really, what's going on?" That's a moment where she chose to take the time to develop a deeper sense of trust. And me choosing to tell her something that's important makes me vulnerable to her and to her actions. But trust is choosing to make something important to me vulnerable to the actions of someone else, and in this case, my partner. Now, distrust is experiencing the reaction of sharing something important by saying, "Well, thank you for acknowledging that. What's going on is I'm having a real dilemma at work and I'm not quite sure how to handle it." And if her reaction was, "Oh, that's not a big deal. You'll get through it. It'll be fine." That's feeling as though what was important to me is being rejected as unimportant. And so that sense of distrust emerges. So my takeaway for you all as we move into having Michael share his wisdom is this, is that as we understand leadership paradigms, it helps us to begin to understand where people are coming from, how they're making meaning, how they are deriving meaning based on sort of the paradigm that they live in. It helps us to understand that leadership definitions evolve based on culture and society and in the time and the period that we're in. That if we can practice our observation skills by listening intently, trying to come to understand what person is really saying, by offering up active listening skills and responses like, "Tell me more. It sounds like you're really stuck." That's going to help us build trust. So often in organizations, people say, "I just wish there was more trust in this organization." And we can point to moments when an employee will say, "Well, I don't want to trust that person because I brought that person a real problem and she disregarded it. That was that betrayal." So those are the things I would recognize you work on. And my final slide, which it just is so near and dear to me, is this. When we talk about this, going back to the beginning and talk about finding voice, this is a picture at the Be and Goody 5K taken a few years ago. I love the Be and Goody 5K run. It's named in honor of 2 of our alumni. Well, in the middle, right along the double line, is a picture of a little guy, about half the size of everybody else. That's a picture of my son a few years ago. And I love this picture because to me it symbolizes how he's trying desperately to find his voice with an immense sense of courage. He's stepping into the arena. He's stepping right into the heart of it, even though that's the harder thing to do, because he wants to try to run with the big kids. There's not many, at that time, I think he was 10 years old, there's not many 10-year-olds who are going to have the courage to step in so that he can try to find his voice as someone who belongs with the big kid runners. That's what I hope for each and every one of you and for every one of your staff, is that you give them the space to have the courage to step into something that's hard, to be trusting that you're going to be listening so that they can try to run with the big kids. All right, with that, I'm going to hand it off to Michael, and he'll share some additional points of wisdom from his vast experience.
Thank you, Drew, so much. And it's really great to be with you and all the folks out there who are listening. You know, as Drew alluded to during his talk, there really has been a shift over the last many years to a more human-centered kind of leadership. It's a trend in leadership training generally that emphasizes a kind of shift away from competence leadership models to authentic leadership models. And what that means is, rather than a myopic focus on the mastery of skills and knowledge, we try to help leaders develop more of their character, their values, and the inner side of leadership that are essential to actually leading other people. You know, in fact, recently the Business Roundtable, which is an assemblage of some of the country's top CEOs in the United States, entered a new declaration about capitalism. They said it's time to move from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, meaning the old mantra that business is only in the business of business and only has allegiance to its shareholders should be supplanted by a commitment to a much wider range of interests that are affected by their activities and affected by capitalism. So there really has been a kind of intellectual movement here, but maybe more importantly than that, the times we're living in demand more compassionate leadership than perhaps at any time in history. I don't know about you guys, but there are days when it feels to me like we're facing a perfect storm of apocalypse. The COVID pandemic is harrowing. People are sick, people are dying. There's an enormous amount of fear, anxiety, loneliness percolating through society. So many of us are working from home, and many of our kids are trying to learn remotely online. And in such an environment, it's hard to fight off personal life creep, where the boundaries blur between work life and work life, and you're fighting to maintain those boundaries. I know in the first week that in my office we were working at home, I literally had to be aggressive about enforcing those boundaries. I remember the first Friday after we had started, I sent a company-wide email saying, okay, that's it, laptops down. I don't want to hear any more from anyone else. Enjoy the weekend. It's important to do that. And I think it's a big challenge to lead people remotely at a distance, and it demands compassion more than anything else. But you know, COVID pandemic's not even the sole thing driving our world today. We have economic duress and growing wealth inequality as a consequence of these forces. I have my adult children who live out west are facing massive wildfires, red skies and difficult air to breathe. The East Coast is facing the worst hurricane season in history. Our politics are bitter and divisive. Our country continues to fight racial strife and protest. So in short, there's a lot of suffering going on in the world. And as far as I know, the only response to suffering is always compassion. There's a great Buddhist teaching that says, everyone you see is suffering something. And I sort of take that mantra to heart. No matter how testy or annoyed I am with someone, I try to realize there's something in that person's life that's a form of suffering. And the more I'm attentive to that, the better leader and steward I will be in relationship to that person. So let me start by talking about two attributes of leadership that I think are timeless, that I think are important elements of compassionate leadership, but are just critical to leadership, period. I think the first is that an authentic leader is always selfless. Leadership, in a sense, is fundamentally about getting the best out of other people. It's trying to do what you need to do to be more other-centered rather than self-centered. In a sense, in order to discover your leadership self, you have to figure out how you're first going to lose yourself. And by the way, that's no easy job. We are all very ego-centered creatures by nature. But the first way we do this is we ensure that we're committed to something bigger than ourselves. You know, the mantra at West Point is duty, honor, country. It's the idea that your service is to an ideal or a purpose bigger than you. I think that's the key to creating and finding meaning and purpose in work, both personally and for the organization. You know, in a sense, I always say to people, leaders really who are good are working to work themselves out of a job. You're actually trying to make yourself dispensable, not like so many self-centered leaders who work to make themselves indispensable. Now, I remember in high school, I was a senior stage manager of this phenomenal high school theater that I was really proud of. And we had this wonderful director, his name was Pat Jones. And every day, Pat Jones would come to the theater and open the doors, and he had this massive key ring. There must have been 200 keys on this chain that he would keep on his belt. And I used to say to him, Mr. Jones, what are all those keys for? He said, you know, my goal in life is to get down to one key. I said, what do you mean? Because I just want one key. I just want to be able to open the door and let you all do the rest. And I've always thought of that story, that my job is to get my office down to one key. And the day that I do that, my work is done and it's time to move on. But perhaps the second essential characteristic of a compassionate leader, and one that Drew placed heavy emphasis, is that they have values at their core. Now, this requires a little unpacking because I think everybody asserts that they have values. Every organization purports to have them, but it's rarely actually true. As I say to myself, to my kids, to my students, to my colleagues and friends, in life, you have to stand for something. You really have to find something to be about. My parents used to teach me that there ought to be 10 principles you'd compromise for no one. Not your spouse, not your children, not your friends, not your colleagues, not for an opportunity at a bigger job, not for more money. In a sense, these principles become your anchor in a storm of confusion and ambiguity and doubt that really marks the world in which a leader operates. It's a decision tree in essence. It's your moral compass to make difficult decisions. When you're presented with a complex, ambiguous question, you test them against your own principled views. And if it flunks number 4, the conversation's over. You know what to do. It's also a way of, no matter what you do, whether you end up being right or wrong, and you will be wrong plenty of times, the key is that you're always at peace with the choice that you made. You're at peace because you did it rigorously, thoughtfully, with the best information you knew at the moment, but you're also at peace because you didn't violate your moral compass. You didn't compromise your principles. You know, Aristotle and the ancient Greeks used to urge everyone to have a life philosophy. It's an idea that I think has sadly evaporated from our society. In other words, I think a person of character has achieved a settled philosophy about some fundamental things. They've taken the time, they've done the work of developing values, virtues, principles, and morals. And more importantly, they live by those precepts, both professionally and personally. That is, they have integrity. They're the same person at home than they are at work. And they communicate those values and they lead from that foundation of those principles in everyday life. I also think it's important to recognize virtues in a particular class of virtues, what I call, or David Brooks calls, the eulogy virtues. First of all, virtues is a really old-fashioned word. You hear values a lot these days, but you don't hear the word virtues very often. I once looked into this, and it seems that there really is a difference between the two. A lot of times we treat values as relative. You have your values, I have mine. They're not always the best thing to unify organizational excellence around. Virtue is an action word. It's more than values, it's that you act consistent with your values. A virtuous person is a person who consistently, through habit and force of activity, lives by the values they hold dear. And I think no matter how much we're all striving and craving for achievement and success, that when the day comes that somebody's going to eulogize our place in the world when we've left it, the things we hope they're going to say about us are that we were compassionate, that we were filled with gratitude, we were people of kindness, we were accepting and forgiving, we had humility, we had a faith and a belief in a higher meaning, we brought joy to the world and those around us, we lived our life in a kind of equipoise and equanimity. I'm pretty sure they're not going to cite our GPAs. They're not going to cite every award we received. And they're not going to cite how much money we made. And I think if one keeps their eyes on the eulogy virtue, they're keeping their eyes, in a sense, on the finish line. And if they're living and leading by those eulogy virtues, I think they'll find great success in life and great happiness. But as I said, losing your ego and yourself is a lot harder than it sounds. And it actually requires a great deal of serious inner work. You know, Claude Debussy once famously said that music is really the space between the notes. And sometimes I think life really is about the space between the notes. Those breaks while we're quiet, while we're contemplative, while we're not performing or singing or talking. What are we doing with that silence? You know, our egocentricity is really a product of our evolution. We're built to crave things that benefit ourselves. We're groomed to crave external rewards, power, money, fame, and acclaim. But the really high quality, authentic leaders are the ones that are moved not by these things at all as an end, but they instead find an inner motivation in the service of others. And to do that, we have to somehow break the chains of being ruled by our own emotions, as we so often are, in order to find calm, to find grace, to find reason, to find reflection. This isn't a class to talk about mindfulness practice, but I think it's an essential attribute to getting in touch with yourself in this way. So let me turn now. I was asked to think a little bit about what's the toolkit? What are the specific ways that at least I've discovered to try to be a more compassionate leader? So I tried to think of a few things. Number one in my toolkit is simply see people. There's one thing I've learned in my life: people want to be noticed. They want to be seen. They want to be appreciated. They want to be celebrated. And there's an interesting irony in leadership, which is the higher you rise, the blurrier your vision becomes around the wider circles of people who work for you or in your organization that are deeper in the organization. You know, I spend a lot of time with my senior staff. I wouldn't naturally spend a lot of time with the most junior employees in the organization. But what I know is that you have to be committed to opening up your peripheral vision and reminding yourself to look wider, look deeper, go find those people again. Let them know that you know who they are, that you notice them on a daily basis. This is really important. I also think people want to be understood. They want to be valued for who they are. And to do that, you have to understand the stories of their lives, not just the actions of their work life. You need to know what their home life is like. Do they have kids? Are they married? Where'd they go to school? Where were they raised? What are the experiences that led them to their beliefs and their skill sets? I think good leaders usually have pretty good working knowledge of the stories that animate the lives of the people who work for them. You need to optimize their roles for success. You know, a lot of times we end up firing people who don't do a job well. And in my office, I have a mantra that says, when we fire someone, we failed. Either we failed because we hired someone unsuited to the position, or we failed because we didn't really work hard enough to match their strengths to the mission. I'm a big believer in situational leadership. And what I mean by that is we play chess at work. What I mean by that is every chess piece has a role on the board. Yeah, somebody's the king, somebody's the queen, someone's a knight, someone's a bishop, someone's a pawn. And sometimes they are playing poorly because they are in the wrong slot. We try to build organizations around the strengths of our people and make sure everybody's an effective and important role that plays to their strengths and minimizes or counterbalances their weaknesses long before we try to give up on anybody. Principle 2, don't just see people, hear people. I'm a big believer that the greatest lost art in the world, I love that Drew was talking about it, is listening. I think most people are terrible active listeners. You have to listen to them, not the chattering voice that's going on inside your head while they're talking, which is what most people do. The great comedian who talks about this, I love this, John Mulaney, he says, you know, keep talking, I'm just waiting for my turn. Most people just sit in conversations and they're just waiting for their turn to talk. Are you really listening? You know, my wife and I have a phrase that say, listen to understand, not to reply. I think most people spend their time listening to reply. Drew talked about the importance of questions and follow-up. Go into their space, lean into their dialogue as opposed to bat it back like a tennis ball with your own. Listening means listening also with an open mind. Sometimes we listen more out of courtesy than seriousness. And an open mind means you're listening without judgment. You're holding back on reaching a conclusion until you fully hear out what the person is talking about. It means listening with empathy, not placing your biases and framework on top of their words, but trying to see it from the angle that they are presenting it. And then most importantly, if you're a real listener, you need to demonstrate to them that you actually heard them by the merits of your responses, but more importantly, by the follow-up of your actions. I often even will take a note. You know, I had a conversation with an employee, note to self, swing back around to their office later this week and say something referencing the conversation as a follow-up. Then they know they were heard. I think that's really important. Principle 3, connect with people. You know, part of my geeky hobbies is I'm kind of a pop physicist. And what that means is I love the concepts, but I can't even begin to do the math. And the laws of physics show us a lot of amazing things about the universe, but one central truth is the centrality of relationships. There's almost nothing that exists singularly in and of itself. It really emerges into reality only from interactions with other things. Relationships are the essential ingredient of the whole world. And you have to take that concept to heart. You seek opportunities to connect. I try to invent ways for connection. In the time of remote work, my assistant sends me a note every day with anybody's birthday and their phone number. And throughout the day, I call all of those people to say hello, happy birthday, and we're glad you work with us. If someone loses a loved one, that's a chance to reach out. If your parents in your organization are starting school and they're frustrated, that's an opportunity to speak. Or you notice that someone's name was in the paper or they were referenced in something, that's an opportunity to tell them you noticed. And find fresh and novel ways to connect with them. Something more special than the routine mechanisms of work communications, like email. I keep a stack of notes on my desk for writing. Written notes sent in the mail mean more to people than any email you could ever send. Small gifts, tokens that recognize people, invitations to participate in something they wouldn't normally do. One thing I like to do at work is to take a young person who's shown real promise in what they do and say, you know what, why don't you come sit in on senior staff? That's not your forum. You're not a senior member of the staff, but why don't you come participate and see what we do? Why don't you go to the Hill and sit with me at a meeting with a senator? Why don't we do a project in which I'm going to let you be the leader and offline you and me will talk about how to do it? Create those moments. I'm a big believer in creating moments. There's a great book I recommend to you called The Power of Moments by Chris and Dan Heath. And they teach that life is a series of moments and that peak moments are the ones that you experience that will stand out in your memory for a long time. And part of the book is about trying to teach you that you can create those moments for people. So we work hard in our office to do that. Hey, it's September, summer's over, fall's over. How can we create a moment for people? What could we send to their home? What could we surprise them with that would do that for them? Point 4, remove splinters. Make it better for people now. You know, one of the things I learned about leadership is there are different rules. There are a lot of little subtle different rules for leaders than there are for the rest of people in the organization, whether you realize it or not. And you can use that power that you hold for other people's good. So you should be working to sweep away obstacles and irritants that are immediately troublesome for your people. If I'm on a call and somebody says, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm late. My computer's really getting messed up and old. When we hang up, I might quietly call the head of IT and say, you know what? Get Roxanne a new computer this week. Well, they're not due for an upgrade till next week. Get it now. Sweep away, remove the splinters. Take problems away from people when you can. Often for a leader, it's really easy, but for the employee, it's really hard. 5, practice urgent patience. This is a term I learned from Gary Burnison, who's the CEO of the recruiting firm Korn Ferry, and a very reflective person. It seems like an idea that's in tension with itself, urgency and patience. But if you sort of meditate on the tension a moment, you can almost feel what that means. It's a leader who keeps things moving but follows the pause principle, meaning they step back a little bit. They listen, they think, they lean forward with more authenticity after moments of reflection. Roman Emperor Augustus used to say, make haste slowly. And in a sense, I think this concept is the one we are more familiar with is, how do you have grace under pressure? Number 6 is share suffering and learn to grieve with others. You remember I said everyone you see is suffering. But then it's important as a leader to get comfortable being uncomfortable with another person. Learning the art of being with someone as they grieve or struggle is really hard. But I can tell you, it's a superpower, and it's one you're going to need in life, whether you want it or not. We recently got terrible news about a lifelong friend of William & Mary who suddenly has terminal cancer. It's viciously painful to us. But we know we're going to have to walk that journey with them as lifelong friends all the way to the end. Those moments come in life, and are you going to be ready for them? And can you show up when they show up? Finally, the last principle, which we've also heard a lot about, is being vulnerable. It's not an easy thing to grab immediately. We seem to admire strength in leaders, not vulnerability. But the first part about it is learning to have an open space for others to be vulnerable with you. I want any class I'm leading or any set of employees I'm leading to feel that they can be vulnerable with me. And in ways that won't be held against them. But more importantly, it's hard to learn as a leader to share your own fears, your own concerns, your own concerns. This year I had to learn to do that during the Black Lives Matter protest. As a Black leader, a lot of employees wanted to ask me about it. We had town halls. And I really had to go inside myself and think about what it made me feel like. And I was open about that with them. My sadness, my fear, my anxiety, my sense of imposter syndrome. Do I belong? That I sometimes live with. COVID provides many more moments like that. What I've learned is while followers want leaders with strength, but they also need to see a degree of vulnerability so that they can demonstrate authenticity, because it will help people see you are not so unlike them at the end of the day. And that as a leader, you have the capacity to understand them and to care for them, and that you have earned the privilege for them to follow you. And I think there's no greater compliment to a leader when a follower does that with a full heart and a full faith that you have their best interest and the mission's interest at heart. That's my toolkit. I'm honored to have a chance to talk to you guys about it. So thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Michael and Drew, for everything you have done for our William & Mary community. It's obvious your leadership has influenced so many members of our community, as well as throughout the world, so many great people. And your compassion is truly contagious. And what you shared with us in this hour today to kick off this webinar series. As my wonderful colleague Roxanne mentioned earlier in her introduction, these webinars are part of a bit of a teaser, a taste of a pilot course that we are likely to offer this spring, hopefully, to our community and to our friends of William & Mary. The course would be an involved version of this type of conversation we experienced today, a more involved, potentially 5-week program. So at this time, I want to invite all of you participating live today to take this short poll. It will help us get some feedback to shape this pilot course and future programs. While you complete that poll, we hope each of you will join us again on September the 29th as we have Mike Petters and Inga Carboni leading our second webinar on inclusivity in leadership. And our final session of this three-part series will address adversity in leadership on October 13th, featuring Jill Ellis and Deidre Connolly. Thank you all for joining us this hour. Any final remarks, Drew or Michael? Just thank you. Well, it was a pleasure, and we look forward to more and more engagement of our community around the topics of leadership. And thank you all for joining us. Take care.